church at Corinth. They were obviously ones of the very first ones to speak up, at least make a commitment. They were probably, the first ones to raise their hand. Yeah, we'll support. By the way, what's the nature of this offering? What's the purpose of this offering?
To help the Jerusalem brothers, yeah.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. The brothers of Jerusalem are going through a very difficult time. Okay, the kinds of offerings, there are, right off the top of my head, there are 3 different kinds of offering that the New Testament endorses or talks about. This is one of them. What kind of offering would you call this? We're taking up a collection for another church. What kind of category? Okay, you're in charge of the budget. What kind of heading do you put on the budget for this kind of an offering?
Free will.
Excuse me?
Free will.
It's definitely a free will offering. In fact, we're going to see that all of the offerings in the New Testament are free will.
Would it be like a love offering because you're showing your love for other brothers?
I can go with that.
Or
I think it really is an expression of love. Yeah.
Or sacrificial?
Yeah. I don't disagree with anything you guys say at all. I totally agree with that. I guess what I'm thinking about it, categorizing that as, would you call this a missions offering? No, I wouldn't call it a missions offering. Would you call it a church offering?
No. It's a goodwill offering, I think. It's more of a goodwill support them. I mean,
support.
It's not to keep. I don't think it's to keep the church going itself, but to keep the people.
Yeah, but it all depends what you define as church.
Right.
If you define it as in the Bible, or it's your
People
brothers and sisters, then
that's
you're
a very
giving
good point.
To the church.
That's a very good point. Did they take up offerings in the local church? Yes, they did. What were the purpose of those offerings? To support the church. Okay, why did the church need support? They didn't have buildings in the first 2 centuries. They usually met in people's homes.
Support their evangelists,
the
widows and the orphans.
Okay, he makes a real point back in chapter 9 about those who preach the gospel should make their living by the gospel. He also makes a point to Timothy that some of the elders, not just the evangelists, but some of the elders who set aside extra time should be reimbursed by the church. Yeah. And the New Testament does make a point about there's a list, and he actually talks about this 1 Timothy 5, I think, where there's priorities given to certain people who don't have family. If you have family, your family's supposed to take care of you. If you don't have family, the church would take care of you. And so there were different kinds of offerings within the church. I would categorize this as by the way, this is not definitive or anything, but just thinking about it, I would categorize this as benevolence. It's kind of an umbrella term, that it's kind of a term, it's not really a missionary offering. You're not supporting a missionary. You're not supporting, which by the way, we do know that in the first century, Paul accepted, from which church did he constantly accept support? Philippi, which was from what region was Philippi from?
Macedonia.
And what do we know about the Macedonian churches?
Pretty poor.
They're the poorest. The poorest of the poor. Yeah, I'm sorry to keep emphasizing that, but that just resonates with me. Just something about that. Anyway, missionary offerings, as far as supporting those who go out and take the message to other places, that's very much so what they did in the church and what they did missionary-wise, but also just taking care of one another, not just locally, but taking care of, there's a need from other churches. So whatever you call it, I call that benevolence.
What's the difference between love, what he said, and benevolence? I mean, I always thought they were synonymous.
Yeah, I guess I think it's probably just the way I use it. It's probably technical, it's not, but I think of benevolence in a financial term. We usually distinguish benevolence from ministry. Benevolence would be somebody can't pay the power bill this month, and it's a legitimate deal. It's not, which by the way, I'm sure I've told you this before, I don't mean to bore you with details, but when somebody can't pay their power bill, does the church pay that for them if they're a member of the church?
Sometimes.
That's the great answer, sometimes. Why is it we don't always pay? Shouldn't we pay power bills if somebody can't pay a power bill?
Well, based upon
what they're spending
their money on.
Why are they in that situation?
Thank you.
Do they properly budget their?
Thank you.
Yes. If the guy's
usually the practice we've made in this congregation, which I fully support, is when somebody comes with a need like that, we usually pay it the first time without hardly asking any questions. If it's somebody in the church, somebody we can trust, or somebody in the church knows. Fall on hard times, one of the last things you want to do is have to go through an interview. You know, if it's somebody we don't know, though, that's a little bit different. And I also think that's biblical. I think there's a set of priorities, household of faith, right? And your own family members. However, when somebody comes back a second time, then we usually sit down and say, hey, how much you got coming in versus how much you got going out? Because some people, it is, I'm sorry, this is going to make me sound so old, but some people I'm just flabbergasted. It's kind of like, okay, you make this much money and here are your regular bills. You're going to go in the hole every month. You know, you cannot live this way. Something's got to change here. And a lot of people are like, oh no, I'll just put it on the credit card. Okay, you can put it on the credit card, but then the credit card grows, and at the end of the year,
28%.
you're still spending more than you bring in.
I don't know what it is now. It used to be like 28%.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is.
Same right now.
I mean, that's what I like about Dennis. He actually, the first time, then he says, we're setting up an appointment so this doesn't happen again.
Yes.
So he'd help them with their budget. I mean, he was just.
I remember one of the first times we did that too.
Wow.
The family's not with us anymore. It happened years ago. But he sat down with them, and it was such a blessing because at that time, I don't know what the interest rate is now, but you could refinance for 3 or 4%. They were paying 12.5% on their mortgage. 12.5%. And he said, you know, all you have to do is take a month, we'll make an appointment, we'll go through there, and church will help you now, and then man, everything will be good. He didn't want to do it because a friend at their bank was the one who set that up for them. And they didn't want to offend their friend. And so he said, well, we'll help you this month, and we'll advise you, this is what we think you need to do. We can't help you any more than that. So that was,
Wow.
Not a good friend.
Maybe they had to head
Second
out
straight
like this.
there.
sorry. Okay, but finances, and again, I'll just share this. There are some extremely fine people, some very mature people in the faith. In fact, I've got some relatives who are intellectually wow, and as far as Christianity goes, I wouldn't trust them with my checkbook.
No.
And it's just interesting to me how some people, you know how some people, they may not have the college degree, but if anything goes wrong with your car, they can take one to listen to it, and they say, well, I know it's not good. And you know, certain people just have aptitudes for certain areas. This financial thing, it just seems to me, just my observation, you know, somebody's a doctor, somebody's whatever, you automatically assume, oh yeah, they know how to do a budget.
No.
Don't assume that. Don't assume that. This financial thing, sometimes we need to help one another out. In benevolence, I'm sorry, this is where I make my distinction.
Okay.
It is a love offering, but benevolence more, in my mind, financially, it's more of a caring, supporting thing. So you help, but sometimes helping's not helping just with money. Sometimes I think it very much involves more than that. Not to get into people's business, but sometimes you need to.
Would benevolence come back to the root of benefactor?
Oh my. Okay. In the New Testament, in that era, they really did have the patron class, they had benefactors, and in fact, from what we can piece together, there were some women who, in fact, the Bible so much as says, there were some women who financially supported Jesus' ministry. They were probably of the patron class. And the reason we assume they were of the patron class, when they met at their house, they had a courtyard area, they had an upper room that could easily seat 12. That's a pretty good sized room, you know. So probably people of means, right? Please remind me of that as we go a little bit further tonight, because he's going to talk about equity. He's going to talk about equality. And I really think terms like diversity, equity, and what's the I stand for? Inclusion have been redefined in our day. And so I think we need to make sure and understand the way the Bible presents this idea, right? But I do want to bring up those classes again, because we're the poor people in the church.
Oh, yeah.
We're the rich people in the church.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sometimes in the weight room this morning, we always ask each other what they're reading since reading the book of Job. And I always thought to myself, Job went through terrible hardship. He was the patron class. He was a guy who had a lot, and he ended up with more. Went through terrible hardship, but he was the upper class as far as finances go. You know that Abraham was, simply because when he went to rescue Lot, it says that he took over 300, was it 312? 320? 300 something. 300 of his male servants who were of the fighting age.
So who knows how many he had? Yeah.
How long's the list of his servants? He's got over 300 male of the fighting that he took with him to go rescue Lot. I'm telling you, when the Bible tells us Abraham was blessed, he was blessed. He had, wow, right? Okay, so we're going to take this in measure because one of the greatest examples of giving, this is a section talking about giving and supporting and helping one another out. One of the classic passages would be the widow's offering, right? That's the opposite extreme, extremely poor. But we're going to talk about proportionately wherever you are. So it's not the amount, it's the proportion, right? Okay, getting way ahead of myself here. But the context, yes, we're helping out another church. And church at Corinth, they were the, I just can relate to this so much because I'm to the point where I try to keep myself from saying what I really want to say, because I'm apt to, when somebody says something, I'm apt to be that person saying, yeah, let's do that. And then next week thinking, oh man, this is really going to be hard to do. I'm one of those people that's right all in, so I try not to say it, even though on the inside I really want to be that way. I want to think through a few days before I go on record, because that's the situation the Corinthians found themselves in. They volunteered first, and Paul is probably reminding them, probably not because they're doing a good job of setting aside the money, probably because they said they were going to do it, but they haven't done so well at this point. We're going to find out, by the way, a little bit later, because written after this will be the book of Romans, they came through. This worked. He reminded them, and they came through with the offering. So let's pick up reading here. Let's have verses 8 and 9 of chapter 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 8.
I am not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich.
Yes, verse 8, I hope this makes perfect sense. When he talks about, I'm not commanding you, that would ruin the whole thing. The whole, hey, this is a love offering from the church.
Right.
Well, it's not really a love offering. If Paul came in and says, do it, right? You got to do this. Somebody called me on the carpet the other day. That's too strong an expression. They challenged me my thinking on this. I frequently say this is between you and God, and what I mean by that is it's got to be free will.
Yeah.
It's got to be a free will offering, but it's not strictly between you and God. There's a lot of other people involved. We're teamed up as far as things that we do, even with offerings. So forgive me if I'm using a term that's too narrow, but what I'm trying to emphasize is this very idea. He's not commanding us to do this. Is there any command in the New Testament that tells you specifically what you're supposed to give?
In the New Testament?
In the New Testament.
As you are able.
Says what?
I thought it said you're supposed to tithe, and tithe is...
Tithe is 10%. That's exactly right. Does it say you're supposed to tithe in the New Covenant?
No.
There's no place.
No.
The closest example you can get to this is when Jesus is talking, and as soon as I say that, I'm going to tell you what Jesus says in a minute. But is that New Covenant? When's the New Covenant start?
After he died.
When Jesus dies. So even examples you give from Jesus, that's still Old Covenant. But what did Jesus say? Jesus was criticizing the religious leaders, and he says, you guys, you tithe everything. You even tithe your spices, down to the cumin and dill, the individual spices. And he says, you ignore the weightier things. He says, You should have done the weightier things without neglecting the other things, the former. So he's not saying forget the tithing. He was commending them. That's a good thing. The problem is you missed the
Big picture.
Yeah, you missed the really big things, right? So there are some reminders like that, but we have no command in the New Testament to tithe. Well, I put it with this verse because what he's talking about here is if God commanded it, that would kind of ruin the whole nature of what offering's supposed to be. This is supposed to be something that you want to participate in. Because of that, I honestly don't mean to put any pressure on anybody or anything like that. I just want you to know, though, I'm saddened sometimes when we think of 10%. I think for some people, 10% is a great goal. They aspire to that. I think other people ought to be way beyond 10%. Because I think I told you about my farmer buddy last week, who, and the thing that just tickled me about that is he made a decision when he got married, they're going to give 40% of everything they make. And which by the way, they didn't give it all to the local church. They had some missionaries in mind. They gave a lot to the local church. They gave a lot to some missionaries. They were able to divide that up, which that's a whole other subject right there. Yeah. But one of the things that I so appreciate about that is they made that decision when they didn't have much money. Yeah. And the purpose was they never wanted to get used to living off all their money. And I just thought there was a lot of wisdom in that, because if you're not faithful, it's Luke chapter 16 that says if you're not faithful with little things, you're not going to be faithful with big things. If you have problems playing Monopoly with somebody and you cheat, and you have problems with that, guess what? That's an indicator that maybe we shouldn't put you in charge of the budget of church. And you might think, oh, that's silly. No, there's a principle here. You can't be trusted with little insignificant things. In fact, in Luke 16 chapter, Jesus specifically says, if you're not faithful at handling worldly wealth, he's talking about money. Mm-hmm. Then the very next thing he says is, who's going to trust true riches to you? Okay, that ties in with what we're going to talk about here, because you want to grow in your relationship with the Lord. The little thing is how you handle your money. The big thing's the spiritual thing. And a lot of times we're looking for big spiritual growth with the Lord. And one of the things I think the Bible's saying is, hey, you got to be faithful with some of these little things first. So let's see how you do with your money, and then we'll move on, right, to some of these other.
Didn't Judas have the money though? Judas Iscariot? He left in with the money, right?
He was the money bag guy.
He was the money guy, right?
And what did he do with that?
Skim.
But he was the money guy.
Mm-hmm.
He was not faithful. Which, by the way, do you think Jesus knew that?
Sure he did.
Oh,
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did. Okay, can I just go ahead and bring this out? We haven't even gotten 2 verses so far yet. But that, I'm glad you bring that point up, because every time I think of the widow's offering, the widow gave in all that she had to live on. And where did she give it? She gave it at the temple. We know that because Jesus is seated opposite the treasury watching what people are putting in, right? We also know, I don't think the Bible tells us this. I think we get this from Jewish history. They had 7 trumpets. They call them trumpets because they were trumpet-shaped. Oh. I always think of do you remember in the mall they used to have this thing you put a penny in?
Yes.
Yeah. The triple force.
I have no idea if it was that big or not, but that's what comes to my mind when I think of that. But the whole idea of these trumpet shaped, they also called them boxes, but they were trumpet shaped, so they obviously had some sort of funnel leading down into it.
Made a lot of noise when it went in.
Yes! Yes! So when you heard a clink, 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 it's kind of like everyone, whoa! Let's look at this offering. Right. Yeah, which would just, fit perfectly with the way the Pharisees wanted to pray, because Pharisees at the hour of prayer, they always stopped to pray in the hour of prayer, they would just so happen to time it that I didn't quite make it to the temple. So here I am in the middle of the street. Oh, time to pray. And so I'm going to stand here on the street corner. They didn't stand out on the street corners just to pray. It was the hour of prayer, and they just happened to be there because they were purposeful. So they can put it on display. Okay, I'm off track again.
They can showboat.
Showboat, yes. Thank you. Okay, but when the widow put her offering in the temple, who's in charge of taking care of the money in the temple?
Levites.
At this time in the New Testament era, it'd be the Sadducees. The Sadducees were in cahoots with the Herodians and certain Pharisees to try to put Jesus to death. In all likelihood, I mean, I think it's a safe bet. Jesus could have come up to this lady and said, you know, I appreciate you want to give, but don't give here. Right? These guys are not going to use your money. And by the way, are 2 coins less than a penny going to make a difference in the temple budget? Not at all. He not only did not stop her, he praised her for what she did. But the point I'm trying to make is this. I think there's a distinction between giving versus what people do with the gift that's given. I think that's a separate issue, and it's an important issue. I think the church really needs to be responsible. In fact, I hope we get a chance to talk about that tonight too. But that's separate from us giving. Now, that does not mean that we're off the hook. You can just give the money to anybody anywhere. I think we are responsible to try to give our monies to God. It's an act of worship, right? But if the people at the church that you give the money to, or the mission that you support, that you give the money to, if it turns out they were crooked, I don't think that's on you, unless you knew about it and you supported them anyway. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's an act of, there's a real sense in which when you give your money, you are really giving it to God, right?
Right.
Okay. Anyway, not commanding you this, by the nature of what we're talking about here, for it to be an act of worship, it can't be commanded. It kind of turns it into something less than what God intended for it to be.
Without compulsion.
Yeah, and he's actually going to talk about that. He's going to talk about that in just a few verses. Okay, let's have, which, by the way, the other point I wanted to make in verse 9, he talks about the example of Jesus. He started off with the example. Sometimes I really do think you give the scripture, you always know what God says, but sometimes I think it's very helpful to consider this person, or consider this prophet, or consider, this story in the Bible, or consider this person in the church. Consider what they've done. In fact, back in chapter, where is it? It's just at the end of the 7th chapter, where he talks about, or boasting about you to Titus. Mm-hmm. He says that in verse 14. Mm-hmm. I think it's appropriate sometimes. Sometimes in the church we're in the habit of saying, which part of me agrees with this, all glory and praise go to the Lord. That's very true. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't praise people sometimes. I think it's very appropriate to be proud of people and put a spotlight on them. Not to the point that we put them on a pedestal or anything like that. But I really do think it's good to point out that brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so, man, they did this great thing. Aren't we all proud as a church to be part of a church family that have somebody do this? I just think that's appropriate. And in this case, he starts off with the example of the churches that are much poorer. And then the second example is the example of Jesus. Well, just can't beat that one. Right? It's like playing your trump card.
That's always a good go-to.
Yeah.
If you can't find anybody else, use Jesus.
Which, by the way, I got to come up with another expression. I can't say trump card anymore now.
Oh, yeah, right.
Because people think...
that word came out long before he was named, so...
Yeah. Okay, let's have verses, let me see, 10 through 12. 10 through 12.
And here's my judgment about what is best for you in this matter. Last year, you were the first not only to give, but also to have the desire to do so. Now finish the work, so that your eager willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it, according to your means. For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have.
Okay, there is so much here. I don't want to get lost in the details here, but this is where he comes right out and says, you were the first, right? And you were first willingly, and you gave the first initial offering. But now he says, follow through. You started off great. Let's keep doing this. And by the way, how do you keep doing this? What was his instruction? How often were they to give?
Every week.
Yeah. This is in the context of day laborers. Day laborers. Most people got paid at the end of each day of work. So why didn't he say set aside money every day? Why did he say set it aside at the first of the week? Why did he say that?
So they would.
So then you wouldn't spend it first?
Okay.
In the first fruit.
Okay. Again, you guys are going deeper. The only point I wanted to make was because they met on the first day of the week. Acts chapter 20, verse 7, that's the time they met. So set it aside for your next meeting. So every meeting, you set a little bit aside. Okay, this is just a general principle. I know it doesn't work for everybody, but most of us, it's a whole lot easier to make payments towards something. I'm not talking about making interest payments. I'm talking about setting aside, if you have an account, a new car account or whatever, set aside a little bit at a time. Because it's really hard to pay big chunks. But you set aside a little bit, and those kind of things tend to grow. And before you know it, oh, look, my new car fund, I'm halfway there or whatever. And however long it takes, but when you constantly set aside, well, he's using the same principle. Don't wait, because I'm sorry for these corny stories, but one of the old preacher stories is some guy was starting a new business, and he went to his preacher and asked for prayer. He said, I really need to support my family, and I promise 10% of being given it to the church and everything. The preacher sat down with him and prayed with him, and his business was very successful. In fact, it kept growing and growing and growing to the point where he came back to the preacher and says, I'm making so much money. He said, I just can't get 10% anymore. That'd be like thousands of dollars every week. The preacher says, well, I'm going to pray for you again, that God would knock you down to the point where you can give 10%. I butchered that story, but you get the basic idea.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the principle of setting aside, which is the other point that I really want to make here. Look at the end of verse 7, according to your means.
Yeah.
And then in verse 12, it says, according to what one, according to what you have, not according to what you do not have. Okay. There is another, I'm trying not to take pot shots here because I've made more than my fair share of mistakes in talking about things. But I think we need to be careful because sometimes on the topic of giving, people will make the point, oh, just give it to God, and then everything else will, you don't have the money, just go ahead and give it anyway. And then somebody was telling me about somebody, I think it was somebody in this room, that wrote out all their checks and to give to the church. They didn't have the money in the bank, but they went ahead and wrote out all their checks. Well, God's going to provide and stuff. Well, they needed to read this verse because this verse says, according to what you have, not according to what you don't have. So you may have a great desire to serve God in a lot of different ways, and you may want to financially support, like, man, I would just love to support that whole ministry. Well, guess what? If God hasn't blessed you with the finances to do that, well, then maybe God's waiting for somebody else to come alongside you. Maybe you're not capable of it. Maybe you can, but the point is, it's based on what you have, not what you don't have. And I think it's bad teaching to tell people, go ahead and promise something you don't have yet, and God will bless you with it. I think that's
That's the wrong way of looking at it.
that's being presumptuous. That's testing God.
Testing God, that
Right.
you're not supposed to do.
Now, first fruits was a principle of you gave on what you expected to have, but you set aside the first. So the first that you actually made. You didn't give what you didn't have, but the first resources that came in, the first thing you did with it is you gave a gift to God. Which, can I share with you this one little thing? Most of you know that I don't watch American TV, I watch Korean TV. And one of the things that I find...
What?
Yeah, I watch Korean TV.
I'm sorry, I'm new to all this. Do you
Subtitles.
oh, okay. I was
Don't worry, he
speak
doesn't
to
speak Korean.
Okay.
No.
I don't think he does. He might be picking it up by the time.
Yeah, I've learned like 5 or 6 Korean words. You'd think I'd learn a lot more by now. But one of the things that I find so interesting, part of Korean culture really saddens me because it's so affected by Buddhism. Christianity is really growing in Korea, and it's having a
Some of the
tremendous
shows do
impact.
have Christian stuff in it.
Yeah, they do have some Christian stuff. but there's a lot of Buddhist. Anyway, one of the cultural things in Korea though is when you get your first job, your first paycheck, you buy stuff for all your family. It's like Christmas time. You don't spend a penny on yourself. So you made $500 your first week. That $500 goes into gifts for mom and dad, brothers and sisters. I love that. Because before you start spending money on yourself, I mean, you're going to spend money on yourself, right? Mm-hmm. But first thing, so it's kind of like a principle. Well, that's first fruits, except it's not just gifts to people, it's gifts to God. But not what you don't have, it's what you do have, right? So that basic principle. Verses 13 through 15.
Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. The goal is equality, as it is written, the one who gathers much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little.
Okay, if you look at that footnote, it's from Exodus 16, and it's an example of who gathered, what were they gathering?
Manna.
And the point was, if you didn't gather enough, you still had enough by the time you got it home. If you gathered too much, guess what? It wasn't around the next day. Because God wanted you to go out and collect the manna every day, except the sixth day you're supposed to gather enough for 2 days. Anyway, so he's trying to reinforce that principle. And he's saying God wants that kind of, I'm going to go ahead and use the word, equality, equity with the churches. Okay, does this mean that God supports a communistic, socialistic
communism?
Yeah, whatever. Is that what he's supporting here with the churches?
No.
Okay. Nobody wants to make that argument in here? Okay, good. But if you don't, how do you explain a passage like this? Yes.
Well, now, first thing that comes to my mind is back to what we talked about, how you're expected to give. In other words, under communism, you're required to share everything, and it's done through the government. This is free will. So, anything that's communal is being done by your own choice to do it. So I think that's the big difference.
And we actually have an example in the book of Acts of that very thing. Mm-hmm. Do you remember the guy who lied about his offering?
Yeah.
What did Peter say to him? Which, by the way, he wasn't in trouble because he didn't give an offering. He didn't give enough. That's not the issue. What was the issue?
He lied.
He lied. And what did Peter say to him? Ananias and Sapphira, he brings them, they sell a piece of land, and it sells for a certain amount of money, but they're going to tell everybody it sold for this, and that's the money they're going to give to the church. So it looks like they're giving everything to the church. Really, their pocket's money. Okay, so they come in, tell the lie. They do it one at a time, which I find very interesting.
Yeah,
Because Peter set Sapphira up. Right, sting operation. Anyway, so when Peter calls him out for it, what does he say to him?
He didn't have to give it all. He could have gave us that
It was
portion
yours.
would tell us it was yours to
He
sell.
even says you didn't even have to give it.
Yeah.
The property was yours. It was a free will thing, and when you didn't have to give it all. So he really endorses this idea of free will. Okay, I want to take it a step further though, because of everything we know about the patron class and the different classes of society that they had at that time. I don't think he's talking about that kind of equity at all. What I think he's talking about is churches over here are hurting and we churches can help. I don't think he's talking about individuals in the church. I think he's talking about you guys have extra now, help them out.
Yeah, and when they have extra, they're going to help you out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think we're talking bigger picture. East.
Not to derail us, but on that note for that story, I
Yes.
think it was one more thing other than just lying.
Yeah.
I think the whole thing too was, since he didn't have to give anything at all, he was trying to make it like they were giving it all so that it can make them look better than everyone else.
Yes, I really agree with that.
Right.
I think that's the attitude that led to that whole debacle there.
I think a
Yeah,
very-
Acts chapter 5. Yeah.
With the gathering of the manna,
Yes.
the people had to work in order to eat. They had to go out and gather. It wasn't just something handed to them.
Yes. Yes. Which, by the way,
They
let's
earned it.
Let's flip over to 2 Thessalonians for just a minute, because I think it's appropriate to read this in the middle of what we're talking about here. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. I want to start reading in verse 6. Are you with me? 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 6, it says, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, we command you. This is not a suggestion. Here's a command. Right? We command you, brothers and sisters, to keep away from every believer who is idle and disruptive and does not live according to the teachings you received from us. Okay, he's really going to hit this idle thing here. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example. We were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's food without paying for it. On the contrary, we worked night and day, laboring and toiling, so that we would not be a burden to any of you. Can I pause for just a second? I'm going to read a little bit more. But this idea sometimes of equity, one of the things that really messes it up is certain people think that other people ought to take care of them.
Yeah. We don't have that problem now, do we?
Oh, my. This is being recorded. Can we? I wish we could push pause for a second. And I'm going to give you an example. Once the video turns off, okay? Because I think this is a concerning attitude that's even within the church, and so we have to be careful. And anyway, he's saying here, let's keep going. He says we didn't want to be a burden to any of you, and he wanted to set an example. Verse 9. We did this not because we did not have the right to such help. Remember he talked about those who preach the gospel should receive their income from the gospel. He says he had the right for that, but in order to offer ourselves as a model for you to imitate. For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule. What's the rule? One who is unwilling. It doesn't say incapable. There are times when people can't.
Unwilling.
But the person who's unwilling to work shall not eat. Okay, who's he talking to here? He's talking to the church, and he's talking to people. Maybe you already get this, but for years, I didn't get this. I always looked at this as, hey, if you're not willing to work, you shouldn't eat. I don't think that's who this is written to. I think this is written to the patron class who, would you stop giving money to that guy? Because here's the principle. Not willing to work shouldn't eat. And the reason he's eating is because you keep feeding him. Okay. I know this sounds really bad, but what does this say about setting up soup kitchens and a bunch of stuff and handing out things to people who live on the street?
Yeah. Actually, there's an example, and I hope this isn't the one, but there's a church not too far from here that still is handing out food one day a week to anybody that drives up and says they need it without any regard for whether they need it or not. And it's just kind of wow, you know.
Yeah, and I want to be very cautious here because I think we need to help true needs. But insofar as we need to help true needs, I really think it's a sin to help people who don't need help. Right? And I think sometimes we brush with too broad a stroke.
I think I have a little bit of difference here.
Okay, good.
Because he's talking to the brothers. Don't relate to the brothers that's idle, and because if he doesn't work, the soup kitchen is a way to reach people that are out in the world, so worldly people coming in, you're helping them.
Yeah, true.
And then once they become, then we teach them.
I'm very glad you brought that up. There is a priority here. Your family within the church, but church family. And I can't remember I think it's in the book of Galatians. I can't remember the reference where it talks about doing good, especially to those who are of the household of faith. There's a priority given here. I actually think it makes my point even a little bit stronger. Simply because the church can't do this for everybody. The priority they're supposed to give to people in the church. And so, if you're going to do this sort of thing, which meeting real needs is very important, the principle still applies. Help those who need, but don't you dare help people who don't have needs, because that's feeding a problem. Right? But thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that. It is talking about brothers. And he actually says don't associate with them. Why? Because that gives a bad reputation to the church. Right?
The world there's a good example if you're looking at the world. There's a lot of people who are celebrities, wealthy people, named people that everyone idolizes out there and whatnot.
Yeah.
They're the ones that get things handed to them for free.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you have people on the streets that people walk by who are just trying to stay warm during winter.
Yeah.
So if you see how the world reacts in these situations, know that that's the opposite direction of how we should be moving.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of add to that, you know, people that are willing to work, but for whatever circumstances can't, like a major depression, that
Yes.
or
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
a soup kitchen as an outreach,
Yes.
you know, that's a good thing. And
Yeah.
the
I always have the problem of overstating things like this because I very much agree with that. Yeah, I very much agree. Those who are willing to work but cannot, I think that's a wonderful ministry. I do wish, though, that sometimes we put a little more effort into finding out, is this somebody who has a real need or not?
Yeah.
Because maybe this is why I'm so calloused. I've been burned so many times helping people out when you find it out they were just playing you.
Mm-hmm.
You know who doesn't play you, though, most of the time? Brother or sister in the church.
Right.
Usually the people that play you, I was over at my son's house the other day. He lives on a busier street than I do. We live in the ghetto, by the way.
No, you don't.
Yeah, I do. But anyway, he lives on a busier street than I do. And so we're on his roof, and I made the mistake of crawling off the roof. As soon as I crawled off the roof, some people walked over and, oh, you know, I'm really hungry. Can I have some money for... You know what? Don't have any money. I'm so glad I didn't have any.
I like the ones that can have a
They
cigarette.
didn't even know.
I don't smoke, yeah.
I didn't even know.
I know what I say, just for fun, get a job.
What you were saying, I remember somebody, local church was handing out food just like that, and it turned out they followed the person. They were going over to the flea market, I think, and he was one setting up and selling it.
Oh,
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
problem that invites.
Right.
And quite
Yeah.
frankly,
Yeah.
it started during a time of need during COVID. They just never stopped doing it. And I'm like,
Right.
they should have stopped a long time ago. Because they're not really, I can't tell that they're doing anything to reach anybody. And it invites too much of what we're talking. So there,
Yeah, fair.
and because there's a limited number, after so many cards, that's the cutoff. Well, if somebody that really had need didn't
Yeah,
make it in
because
time,
there are people with real needs. There are people with real needs. But there is something else we're supporting. We're not just doing that. We had a young man here years ago who ended up living on the street for a year or two, and he got arrested. I went and visited him after his arrest and found out it was robbery. And I said, you know, at times, especially with somebody younger than me, and I'm their preacher, I feel like I can talk to him like I'm their dad. So I gave him the, what are you thinking thing. And his point was, I was hungry. It wasn't a sin, I was hungry. Like, it was a sin. I'm sorry you were hungry, but let's think, why were you hungry? Because you were living on the street. You didn't have to live on the street. I don't know a lot of people's stories. I knew his story. His brother really wanted to take him in. There were other people willing to take him in. He had job opportunities. He just didn't want to do anything. So he's living on the street of his own free will. And then he got hungry. And he thought, I'm hungry. It's okay for me to take this because he was some.
Well, he ain't hungry now.
Yeah, it was I think it was a convenience store, but it was some place, and his thinking was, oh, they've got a lot of money. Yeah. That mentality really bothers me too, because every time you think of the, you know, oh, they've got a lot of money, what you really is, you're picking the pocket of a whole bunch of people. You're not picking one individual's pocket. You're picking, but you're still taking it from people. That's where it comes from. So, oh boy, am I off track. Anyway, let's come back to this. So this idea of equality, he's talking about maybe it's not time for us to, you know, put down the plush carpets and things like that when a sister church is really in need, right? When we got sister churches that we can help out, let's do that. Which, if I can just say how proud I am of this congregation, I really am, for that reason, because we had a sister church on the other side of the river, and they would have gone under. And you know what? It's not big, but they're thriving. In a lot of different ways, they're thriving.
For the first
And
time.
I'm proud of this church because this church made a lot of sacrifices. And we're not a big church, but we were in a place where we could do stuff, and we did stuff. And I'm proud to be part of a church like that. Really, yeah. And I'm hoping we've got some other little churches around here. Yeah. I'm hoping there's another church we're in talks with right now that maybe in the next year or two we're going to be able to do this again. It won't be as financially a big a commitment, but there's going to be some other things that we're going to have to do. But you know what? Well, why should we have it easy and other churches suffer if we can help them out? Let's help them out, right? So that tickles me. Okay, verses 16. Let's go all the way down through.
Good Lord, let me get back.
16 through 21.
Still an 8, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
yes.
Okay, sorry, I was backing the other one. Thanks be to God who put into the heart of Titus the same concern I have for you. For Titus not only welcomed our appeal, but he is coming to you with much enthusiasm and on his own initiative. And we are sending along with him the brother who is praised by all the churches for his service to the gospel. What is more, he has chosen by the churches to accompany us as we carry the offering, which we administered in order to honor the Lord himself and to show our eagerness to help. We want to avoid any criticism of the way we administer this liberal gift, for we are taking pains to do what is right, not only in the eyes of the Lord, but also in the eyes of man.
Thank you so much. Okay, this is one of those passages. I'm glad we're going to stick with the main topic here, but it's an opportunity to talk about this. This brother he mentions in verse 18, we have no idea who this is. And everybody's like, well, why didn't he name him? And so I'm telling you, commentaries go into paragraph after paragraph, speculating and everything. It's kind of like, he didn't name him. You know? And so one of the great theories is they all knew who he was talking about anyway. Okay, but I just find that interesting. Some names are put in Scripture. They're going to be remembered the next 2,000 years. Maybe this guy had a problem with his ego. Maybe. So he's doing a good thing. That's great. We're glad that this person's doing a great thing. We're not going to put your name in the Scripture.
Maybe
I have no idea.
But
Yeah.
I remember reading, I think it was John Wenham. Are you familiar with him? There were two Wenhams. I think it was John. His thesis was that Luke was written very early, and he said this could be translated. He was famous for publishing the gospel, and he was trying to argue that this was Luke's gospel.
The Theophilus guy? Maybe. Yeah. I don't know. There are a lot of theories out there.
I just wonder if you
But at the
heard
end of the
that
day,
one.
no.
So, okay. So you
Honestly,
haven't heard that it could be published as gospel instead of preaching. The word there.
Oh. Gotcha. Could be. And I'll confess, there are certain issues that just really don't interest me, so I stop.
Okay. I'm just curious to have an encyclopedic knowledge.
That's
of this
curious.
stuff. All right.
That's curious.
Well, it
Good.
must have been a lot of money because it says liberal. So it must have
Yes.
been, it must have been, maybe the person wanted to be anonymous.
Well, no, there's a lot of speculation, but
And just giving.
that could be too. But let's actually get down to the content here that he's really focusing on, verse 20 and 21. This is the side, we're talking about the offering side. Now, once the offering is given, we need to be careful. Because even if it is a liberal gift, so it's probably sizable, but even if it's not sizable, if you're not faithful to little things, you're not going to be faithful to big things. You need to be careful with the way money's given. So what does that mean? That means above board. So even if you totally, I'm going to pick on Willie, we totally trust Willie. Willie is not allowed to count the money by himself.
That's right.
Right? We just have a policy, always two people. And we've set things up, and I'm not saying it has to be this way. I'm saying there has to be some sort of above boardness, right? Mm-hmm. And so here at this congregation, we always have two people count, and the people who count, it's totally separate from the people who spend. So Lisa is our bookkeeper, and we've got Susie. She's on this side. She never gets to touch the money. Why? Because she's got the checks. and she has to give an account to Lisa, and Lisa turns in the reports. So there's checks and balances on both sides, simply because we want to be able to show to the world, as well as people in the church, hey, we're being above board. And in addition to that, sometimes you're putting a great temptation in front of somebody who normally wouldn't be tempted with something like that. but nobody else is around. There's a whole bunch of money, a whole bunch of cash. You don't want to do that.
I need a new boat.
I love the way you say need. Yeah. Oh,
When
The
I
other one sunk.
when I first came to Merritt Island, there was a church here on the island that went through a big debacle because the finance person, there wasn't checks and balances, and they ran off with a lot of money. It took the church a while to recover from that. But it was kind of like, oh, we're all church, we trust each other. Well, yeah, we trust each other, and you're still not counting the money by yourself, right?
Yes.
And so we even, this might sound kind of silly, but we have offering boxes, and we'll talk about that next lesson, because this is taking way too long. We'll put it in the next lesson, why we decided to go offering boxes instead of our offering plates. But offering boxes over at the other campus, they are not allowed to open up the offering box unless there's more than one person there. And two people have to sign this envelope that gets sealed, and then it's brought over here to put with the rest of the offering. And if it's tampered with, but we've got signatures on there and stuff like that. Well, it's not a major part of our offering, but it's still checks and balances, right?
Accountability.
And, yeah, it's accountability. And part of the reason we're doing this is because we don't want anybody looking at that person. We want everybody to know that
They're above board.
yeah, he's not taking advantage. He can't take advantage of the church. There's other people checking on him on both sides, right? So things like that. I just think it's emphasizing doing this. From what we can tell, Paul wasn't involved in this at all.
Right.
He traveled with these guys, but they took care of the money. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. The way I was taught as a minister, I have never seen what people give. I get to see the budget, I get to see the offerings, but I have no idea who puts in what. Every now and then there's been some reasons why I found out certain things here and there, just like you would find out certain things here and there. But as a regular matter of fact, never see that. I did one time, in fact, we did this more than once because I thought it was very educational. I don't remember if it was Lisa or before Lisa, or whoever the bookkeeper was. I had them write down for us, okay, there are 300 people coming, but there's only 60 people putting money in the offering plate. And 2 people give $10,000 or more. 3 people give in no names or anything like that. But it was quite educational just to see, where it breaks down. And I kind of like that because it's motivational too, especially when names aren't involved. Anyway, I was just trying to make the point that we need to be above board. Let's go ahead and finish off this chapter, verses 22 through 24.
In addition, we are sending with them our brother, who has often proved to us in many ways that he is zealous, and now even more so because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and co-worker among you. As for our brothers, they are representatives of the churches and an honor to Christ. Therefore, show these men the proof of your love and the reason for our pride in you, so that the churches can see it.
Thank you. Again, notice he mentions our pride in you. And so he's used the churches in Macedonia as an example. And he says, in so many words, I want to use you as an example too. I want to be able to go to the churches and say, hey, guess what the churches in Achaia did? Well, he's going to do that. And when he writes the church at Rome, the end of Rome, he's going to talk about the Macedonian churches and the churches of Achaia. So obviously they did come through. The only other thing I wanted to say, and then we'll turn the video off because I got a story I want to tell you. But the only other thing I want to say about this is over in chapter 12, so we're going to get this later, he's still going to talk about money, this offering, and some really rich stuff as far as how and why you should give. It's really going to get rich in the first part of the ninth chapter, right? But over in chapter 12, he comes back on this subject of giving again, and he says, by the way, I could care less about your money. Mm-hmm. He says, the reason I'm talking about this is I'm concerned about your spiritual relationship with God. He says the same thing to the church at Philippi when he says, I always took the offerings from you, not because I needed the money, but I took it because I knew that was helping you grow. I love that. I really love that because there are a lot of barometers in life. I know it's not a rule of thumb, but generally speaking, you can step on scales and tell something about your physical health, right? You know, sometimes when it's like, I weigh how much?
Yeah.
It's an eye opener, you know, and stuff like that. Well, the scales you can step on to measure your spiritual health, one of those scales are your checkbook. It really is. Sometimes we give ourselves a pass there and say, oh yeah, but I'm praying, I'm doing all this. The Bible says you need to look, because where your treasure is, there will your heart. You know the rest of that? Heart be also, Jesus said. So it is a good barometer. That's why I love the fact that we've got so much teaching on this.